Welcome to the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Join us each week as we sit down with the founder of Alchemy Wealth Management and author of Your Fiscal Physical, Ryan Nelson. Tune in to gain valuable insights and practical tips as we simplify complex financial concepts into digestible lessons. From budgeting to retirement planning, this podcast is your go-to resource for mastering financial literacy.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Your Fiscal Physical Podcast. My name is Aaron, and I am joined, as always, by Ryan Nelson, founder of Alchemy Wealth Management, popular selling author of Your Fiscal Physical, 7 Keys to Becoming Financially Fit. Find that on Amazon. And we want to thank all the listeners. We are into, this will be episode 4, I believe, that we're recording here. So, thanks for being here, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, without a doubt, and we're looking forward to getting into this week's topic of what is a bond, and I am very excited for this topic. When we were kind of outlining these, I was like, this is a great question. This is something I'm pretty naive as far as what a bond actually is. I feel pretty good about what a stock is, but so I'm excited to kind of have you, share that with the listeners to kind of break down what a bond is and kind of peel back that enigma of what it is and what it isn't, and how it can be a part of your financial future or financial planning just in general here.
Yeah, let's do it. So back on episode 2, we discussed what a stock was, and in that episode I mentioned there's 3 main types of investment classes for retirement planning. There's cash, bonds, and stock. So we described what the stock was. Today we'll describe what the bond is. And really, I think you could argue there's a 4th asset class there, and that 4th class we can touch on that in a future episode. But really, the 3 main classes that most people refer to are going to be cash, bonds, and stock. So a bond, if you kind of think of that hierarchy, stocks were at the top of the hierarchy, and so the stocks are going to be higher risk, higher expected returns. Bonds are going to be in the middle of this hierarchy. So kind of middle of the road risk, middle of the road expected returns. And so the way a bond actually functions, in the stock example, we said you actually give your money up to somebody, you give it to somebody else, and in return, you get ownership of a company, right? A bond operates a little bit differently. A bond, you actually lend your money. So if you were to lend your $1,000 out to a company or institution, so maybe you lend your $1,000 to the U.S. government. The U.S. government is going to do something with that $1,000, and they're going to effectively pay you interest for that for allowing them to borrow that $1,000, and then at the end of whatever the term is, they're going to pay you the $1,000 back. So a common example, maybe you give, these numbers are just arbitrary, and I like round numbers, so these numbers don't make a ton of sense, but it'll help illustrate the point. Mm-hmm. So maybe you give your $1,000 to the U.S. government. They say, awesome, thank you. We're going to give you $100 a year, which that's way higher. They'll never give you $100 a year, but they give you, $100 a year, say for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they say, thank you, Aaron, for letting us use your $1,000. Here's your $1,000 back. So the nice thing about a bond is it's a structured note. So when you're going into it, how much they're going to pay you, when they're going to pay you, and when you get your principal or your initial investment back. So that's all really nice. The catch is, because it's so structured and you know exactly what you're going to be getting, they can afford to sort of pay you less than what you might be able to get from a stock. So again, if you're thinking about the U.S. government, and they're trying to decide, okay, how much interest do we essentially have to offer to people for that to basically, more or less convince them to let us use their money, to lend us their money. It's a pretty secure investment. A lot of people will say the U.S. government is the most secure investment in the world. It's backed by the U.S. taxpayer. So effectively what that means, if they struggle to make their payments, they have the power to raise our taxes. So anytime you lend money to the U.S. government, it's backed by us, the U.S. taxpayer. Mm-hmm. And so that's a pretty secure investment. And so what that means is there's a high degree of likelihood you're going to get those annual payments you were kind of, I'll put in air quotes, promised. And then it's a high degree of likelihood you're going to get your $1,000, that original principal, back at the end, right? And so they probably don't have to offer you that much money on an annual basis for to kind of convince you to engage in that investment or buy that bond, which would be you lending that money to them. So again, high level of bond, you're actually lending your money to somebody else. They're paying you interest over a fixed amount of time, and then they're returning the principal back to you at the end of that fixed amount of time.
Yeah, then that's really good to kind of break it down like that, and it kind of answers the next question that I had as far as why would someone invest in bonds, and the big one that I feel you just hit on is it's backed by the U.S. government. The security of it, if you will, is pretty high as far as a bond goes.
Yeah, well, great. So let's touch on that. So the U.S. government is one place you could buy a bond from.
Okay, gotcha.
But there's lots of difference. So I know the last couple of weeks we've been using Apple Computers as an example of what happens if you buy an Apple Computer stock, right? Well, Apple Computers could also choose to issue bonds. So if Apple Computers wants to raise some funds, right, they could issue Apple Computer bonds, in which case I could lend my $1,000 to Apple Computers. They would pay me a fixed interest rate back. And again, say maybe it's for 10 years. They pay me a fixed amount back for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they'd return my $1,000 to me. Now, if we think about that, if I'm going to give my money to maybe the U.S. government or to Apple Computers, which one do I have more? In fact, which one would you have more conviction will be here 10 years from now?
The U.S. government. I don't think
I knock on wood, none of us know, right?
Right.
But I think most people are in your same boat, that most people believe the U.S. government's going to be here 10 years from now. Most people probably think Apple Computers will be here 10 years from now too, but it's a less like, I can imagine a world in which it's not. And so if you were lending your money to either one, if they were both offering you the same interest rate, you'd say, I'll go with the U.S. government. Right? Sure. So nobody would ever buy an Apple Computers bond. And so what that means is in order for Apple Computers to sort of incentivize you to maybe lend your money to them instead, they have to pay a higher interest rate. And then if we were to even go further down this, there could be an even smaller company. Maybe, again, we used an example earlier in a previous episode of a biotech company. If a biotech company was raising funds and you're like, man, I have no idea if you're going to be here in 10 years, right, then you'd be pretty hesitant to lend your money to them. But if they were to offer you a high enough yield, you may say, okay, I'll take that risk. I'll give you my $1,000 and you're paying a high enough amount that I'll take that risk that maybe you're not here in 10 years, right? So when you look at bonds, it's not just in government. Any company effectively can issue a bond. Those would be what we refer to as corporate bonds. So there's corporate bonds and there's government bonds. Government bonds would be from the government. Corporate bonds would be from corporations.
Sure.
So there's government and corporate bonds. Especially if you look at corporate bonds, there's a wide range of different companies from low risk to high risk. And so bonds can vary drastically in the amount of risk you're taking. Therefore, they vary drastically in how much they're willing to pay as well. So it's not just a fixed amount, like bonds aren't just a fixed amount. All bonds pay the same. Really, all bonds are going to pay a little bit differently depending on the company issuing the bond, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And one thing we want to make sure we let the listeners know and anybody out there is we're not endorsing Apple Computers specifically. It's just a very common. Everybody knows about Apple.
Yeah.
Everyone either has heard of the iPhone or the MacBook, whatever it might be. So we're not sponsored by them, and we're not endorsing like buying them as a company specifically. But they're just an easy example to use overall.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, we're just using all these companies as just examples, not any recommendations for any buys or sells or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that I didn't just go out and buy thousands of shares of Apple because it's been brought up on this podcast so much. I mean, I don't know if that's a good or bad idea, but maybe talk to your financial advisor about that before you do anything like that. So one other term that gets thrown around with bonds, and I'd love to have it broken down, is maturity date. Mm-hmm. What is the maturity date for a bond, and how does that kind of apply to or differ, I suppose, as far as what that means?
Yeah, so the maturity date is the date at which effectively the contract ends, and when the company or the government would return your original principal. So in those examples I was mentioning, where if I lend, if I bought a 10-year bond, and I lended my money out, my $1,000 for 10 years, the maturity date would be 10 years from now. So maybe January 1st or January 30th of 2040,
sure.
2044, right?
Wow, that's wild.
And so the maturity date would be that date at which this contract ends. And then if it was a U.S. government bond, it's when the U.S. government would give me my $1,000 back.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's, you can kind of think of it as people talk about being mature, or this is when I come of age, if you will. You can kind of kind of similar to that in regards to a bond. Like, hey, cool, this is when you're going to get your money back.
Yeah, that'd be a good way of committing it to memory for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Well, that's great, Ryan. I appreciate you, kind of sharing that information on what a bond is, and hopefully everybody will, when they see that in their portfolio or whatever it might be, or someone talks about on the news, like, oh, these certain bonds, like now you kind of have an idea behind that curtain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, we'll be right back with some personal stuff to discuss as far as bonds go. Hang tight.
And now to put the personal in personal finance.
All right, Ryan, so I got another story here for you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it as far as when it revolves around bonds specifically. So growing up, my grandma, we called her Granny, used to, for our birthdays and Christmas, give us savings bonds. And as a 8, 9, 10-year-old, being handed a $50 bond, being like, hey, this is a $50 bond, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. I have $50 in my hands. And her being like, actually, no, you can't spend that now. You have to wait until it matures. And me being like, well, thanks for nothing then. Like, I can't go out and buy this, candy or this toy that I want with this here. And I think that it's a way of kind of looking at like savings bonds overall that was eye-opening to me, to be like, hey, like, what is the value of these specifically?
Right. Yeah, that's funny. And that was probably a blessing and a lesson in savings probably that your grandma was trying to pass on. But so once you buy that bond, it's not necessarily liquid anymore, so you couldn't use that $50 to go buy a video game or a toy you wanted, right? But the good thing about it is 10 years later, whatever duration this particular bond was, 10 years later, maybe instead of having $50, you now have $100, right? And so the cool thing about that would be, if you have the patience, right?
Sure.
Maybe let's just say, let's say you wanted to buy a toy that cost $10. Well, when your grandma originally gifted you that savings bond, you could have, if she just gave you $50, you could have bought 5 toys.
Sure.
That would have been pretty cool.
That would have been awesome.
Right? But by her gifting you a savings bond, maybe 10 years later, that $50 grew into $100. Okay. But over that same period of time, that I bet you that cost of the toy got a little bit more expensive as well, right? Mm-hmm. That's inflation. And so 10 years later, you might have $100 now, but the cost of the toy has gone up. So it used to cost $10, maybe it costs $11 now. But guess what? You now have $100. The toy costs $11. You could now buy 9 of those toys, right? So it's a lesson in investing, being patient, compounding interest. And so having, originally if your grandma would have given you that toy again the money on day one, you could have bought 5 toys. By investing and having a longer term approach, even after inflation, maybe you could afford 9 toys when it matured, right? And I think that's just a good analogy too, just for retirement planning. It's the same concept, if you put money away 30, 40 years, it sucks. You're not going to the football game this year. You're not buying the new car this year. But you start accumulating wealth at a faster rate than inflation is growing at, and you can actually accomplish more with your wealth over your lifetime. So,
well, that actually paints it in a way that, 8-year-old me still wouldn't have understood that. Like, he wanted the toy, he wanted this Rock'em Sock'em Robot, but now, me being 33, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, that makes it. I think about like time is just going by so fast these days. So like people talk about 60, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm over halfway there. So like it makes more sense to me to kind of be like, cool, I can let this mature and wait on this. I don't need to specifically do this right now because I don't want to be working when I'm 62. Yeah. Like
your hairline indicates you're like 3/4 of the way there.
Yeah, some might say, yeah. Right there, close to death. I do have a trivia question here for you,
Let's
Ryan.
Hear it.
So, and this came from the internet, and I just Googled it. So, trust that, take that with what it's worth. But
sure, let's have a little fun with it.
Yeah. In what year was the first U.S. Treasury bond issued?
Ooh, that's tough. I literally have zero idea. So, let's say the first U.S. Treasury bond. I'll say 1932.
Ooh, pretty close. 1917.
Oh, 1917.
Actually. They were called Liberty bonds, and they were used to fund U.S. involvement in World War I.
Oh, interesting.
Is what they were.
Okay.
So cool. I'm glad.
You didn't happen to see how much they raised, did you?
I didn't actually know. That was probably enough to go overseas.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. I was like, to think about like that. You can kind of call something a Liberty bond, and everybody wanted to buy it to support the country, and you're like, all right, well, you're just loaning them money.
Yeah, that's awesome
in a way. But awesome. Well, that kind of wraps up our discussion on bonds here. We want to really thank the listeners for checking it out. Please leave feedback. Like I said, send us the email at podcast@alchemywealth.com, and I'm excited to kind of bring these future future conversations as far as your personal questions and kind of break those down for you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Aaron. Always enjoy, and as always, stay the course.
Thank you for joining us for the Fiscal Physical Podcast. Until next time, happy listening, and as always, stay the course. If you have a question or topic suggestions, please email us at podcast@alchemywealth.com. If you enjoyed today's discussion, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you never miss an episode, and consider leaving us a rating and review on your favorite platform. This helps other listeners like you find the show. For more resources, you can visit Alchemy Wealth Management's website at www.alchemywealth.com or find your Fiscal Physical, the book, on Amazon. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that personal finance is just that, personal. Please don't take anything we say as advice. The preceding content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It's not an offer or a solicitation, nor should it be construed or relied upon for tax, legal, or investment advice. It doesn't consider your personal financial situation or objectives and may not be suitable for you.